Hello to everybody and welcome to our webinar on the research lessons from the Texas floods. We do have a stellar cast to explore the lessons today with you. I would be remiss of me not to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of which I am on today. I'm in Canberra, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and pay acknowledgement to them and also the role of First Nations knowledges in exploring this problem as well. We've got a fantastic lineup of speakers. We've got Chad Berginnis, who's the Executive Director of the American Association of Floodplain Managers. We've also got Will Prentice, Technical Director of the Floodplain Management Australia. We've got Wendy Sharples, one of our fantastic researchers from the Bureau of Meteorology. And of course, we've got Webb as well. And this is another one of the great webinars we've been doing in partnership with AFAC there as well. This will be recorded today. Unfortunately, due to the late start, we will probably be very limited in our ability to do any Q&A today, but we will be able to get through our speakers there in time. But if you do have any pressing questions, still please put them in the Q&A and we'll circulate those. And if speakers want to respond to any after today, we'll recirculate those questions, those answers. So yeah, Texas floods, I'm not going to say any more other than a great event to be able to explore further. And I'm going to now hand over to Chad Berginnis. So Chad, thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And good morning, everybody. It is evening here in central Kansas. For those of you that may not know the geography of the United States, central Kansas also is in Tornado Alley. And we have literally just had a severe thunderstorm pass, and the severe weather alert had indicated that we may have up to tennis ball size hail here. So if there's flashing in the background, it is not a special lighting effect, but it seems somewhat appropriate for this particular presentation. So let me start off in talking about flash flooding as a national issue here in the United States. The National Weather Service here has a formal definition of flash flooding. And essentially, the causes can be natural, but also it does extend to dam or levee breaks, mudslides and debris flow, even ice jams or rapid snowmelt. And of course, with flash flooding, you have a lot of different dangers associated with that. In addition to speed and the force of the water, the debris, the rapid rise. But probably one of the deadliest factors is really the surprise factor. And when you have flash flooding that occurs, for example, in the middle of the night, then you will have a lot of potential impacts. Now, flash flooding also occurs in both rural and urban settings. And in rural settings in particular is where you typically will find camps or campgrounds or RV parks. And throughout my presentation, I kind of lump all of those the same, whether it's a campground, an overnight camp, or somewhere that you would take a recreational vehicle that way. But here in the United States, we really have three different types and levels of alerts. We have a flash flood watch, we have a flash flood warning, and then even new to me after the Texas flood is the flash flood emergency, which is pretty rare. And in this graphic, one of the things that you'll see is from 2023, there were over 3,700 flash flood warnings issued in the United States. However, in that same year, there were only 29 flash flood emergencies. So it gives you a relative order of magnitude in terms of the rarity of those. Interestingly, here in the summer of 2025, we are averaging about a 70% above normal rate of flash flood warnings. So flash flooding has been a pervasive issue this year. And where I live in the state of Ohio, flash flooding is an issue there. And so in the aerial photograph, what you'll see is a campground with a flood hazard area superimposed on that. And in the inset is my dad, as well as my three kids. And of course, the RV that my dad loves to go around to campgrounds all over the place. But this is an area called the Wally World Riverside Resort in Loudonville, Ohio. And In that particular area, there are campgrounds, just one right after the other on the Mohican River. It probably is the most flash flood prone area in the state of Ohio. About 20 years ago, in 2006, an afternoon thunderstorm developed and moved through this area, probably about 5 miles or so away from there. And up to, and I try to do my conversions to metric, 19 centimeters of rain fell in a 2-hour period. And it truly was probably our last big flash flood event in Ohio, but a nearby state park had over 700 people evacuated. And because it happened so quickly, most of those were by boat, and you had washouts of about 15 roads in the area. And so when you think about recreational vehicles, during a flash flood, one of the things that people might be prone to doing is they want to protect their very expensive rig, and so they're trying to pull out. Well, if you have most of the roads washed out, then you're actually creating a much worse and a much more hazardous situation as well. But all the talk this summer really focused on our Independence Day flood in Texas. And I'll be honest with you, I did not appreciate the flash flood potential of this particular area. It's also called the Texas Hill Country and Flash Flood Alley, and it is on the Guadalupe River. But the Guadalupe, as I've researched, has a very long history of deadly flash floods. And in fact, it wasn't too many years ago where a bus of campers actually died while the bus was trying to cross a flooded road. But in this particular event, there were 138 deaths. 119 of them was in Kerr County, which really was the epicenter of the flash flood. And early estimates were about $18 billion in damages. Now, it wasn't only from this single flash flood, but there was a series of flash floods over the period of about a week. And one of the things, if you want to know a little bit more of the history, you can check out a documentary, Flash Flood Alley, by the producer Marshall Freck, and that's available on Vimeo, I believe. And it gives a really fascinating history, as well as the politics of flooding and flash flooding in the Texas Hill Country. Let's talk about the catastrophe that was Camp Mystic. Camp Mystic is in Kerr County. It is in the area that was impacted most severely by this flash flood. In this camp, 27 campers and counselors died. We had early warnings provided by the National Weather Service. The day prior, at 1:18 p.m., was a flood watch, and the meteorologists were getting a sense that there was a setup occurring that could result in some pretty significant flash flooding. But then as our deadliest floods happened overnight, we had the first flash flood warning at about 1:14 a.m., and then a flash flood emergency declared at 4:03 a.m. Now, this was a big holiday weekend for us, and unfortunately, the local officials and local warnings were not provided by the county, and also there were no warning sirens in the vicinity of Camp Mystic. It's also notable that it is in a spotty cell phone service reception areas. And so one of the technologies that has improved a lot over the years are wireless emergency alerts. But unfortunately, again, that would have been hit and miss in those areas. According to the best information in the hydrographs, and the newspaper reports are a little bit differing on this item, but the best estimates are the Guadalupe River rose about 7.6 meters in 2 hours between 3 a.m. and 5:15 a.m. Also, as newspaper accounts have reported, there appeared to be delays up to 75 minutes in Camp Mystic after the initial flash flood warning was issued. Based on some of the interviews, the Camp Mystic director really conferred with the employees on how to respond to the alert. And then, as was quoted by one of the folks, the camp descended into chaos as the floodwaters rose. It's also, there was a hearing held after in the Texas legislature, And in the hearing, testimony was provided that on the afternoon and overnight, the county emergency management director was indisposed. With all of those factors coming together, and I can say that the Association of State Floodplain Managers, our organization, had done many media interviews, over 24. And so we did a lot of research into the camp, and in talking with the reporters and talking with our Texas chapter, we really came up with about 5 or so findings that I think are really applicable, not only in for this situation, but I think have applicability all across areas that are flash flood prone. And the first of those is that we have a gap in regulatory and oversight measures for camps and campgrounds. Typical floodplain regulations in the states don't do much. And if there's any standards at all, they're typically through local or state health departments, which tend to license campgrounds. But what they will focus on are things like sewage or water or food safety, and not necessarily natural hazard threats. The National Flood Insurance Program, which really gives us the base standards for floodplain management in the United States, does not have any minimum requirements for parks or campgrounds, although FEMA suggests that campgrounds can be good uses for floodplains when you have seasonal flooding, but really shouldn't be permitted in campground areas. Nonetheless, the standards don't reflect that. And one of the recommendations and ideas is to consider prohibitions for new cabins or sites, or having land use standards for temporary or overnight occupancy on existing sites, and requirements for warning systems and emergency action plans. In the aftermath, one of the things that I'm excited to report is the Texas legislature is considering a bill called Texas Senate Bill 1 that has a number of these factors, and I think would remedy many of this regulatory gap. The second is that advanced warnings only work when paired with action plans. And throughout my career, I've been doing floodplain management for over 30 years. I used to say often that a siren on a pole really doesn't do a whole lot for you. That siren has to be tied to a monitoring system, and that monitoring system has to be tied to procedures and processes where action is actually taken. There has been a lot of progress in the last 5 years on low-cost flood sensors for monitoring and warning. I was at one of our chapter meetings 2 weeks ago, and I was talking to a vendor that had a low-cost flood sensor system plus internet-based dashboard for a subscription cost of about $1,500 per year. And that is an order of magnitude cheaper than a lot of the top-of-the-line warning systems that you might find. So again, there's progress being made there. There's also been a lot of social science research on flood warnings. There is a resource that is freely available called the Warning Lexicon. In 2023, you can search that online, and there's a tool to help craft effective warning messages, and even some pre-canned warning messages for flash flooding. But there's also many ways to monitor and warn of flash flooding. You don't necessarily need a siren. Here in the United States, the National Weather Service coverage with simple NOAA weather radios, and those have nationwide coverage where you can key actions off of different warning levels from the National Weather Service. You also can have warnings, you can have these low-cost sensors, but it doesn't mean you have to make a huge monetary investment to have an effective approach. Emergency action plans for flash flooding in campgrounds or RV parks are non-existent or usually insufficient. And again, where there may be standards, emergency action plans may or may not be required. County emergency managers, local emergency managers often have the background and training to be able to help camp owners to craft those plans, but typically those offices are very understaffed and they don't have the resources needed to probably service everybody. Here in the United States, the American Camp Association actually has a standard for camps site-specific emergency procedures to respond to natural disasters that way. However, And this is one of the biggest deficiencies that I've noted in reviewing several EAPs out there, is that often they're too generic. And so, for instance, flash flooding may be lumped into a severe weather event. So think about this. In a tornado, which is also a severe weather event, where is your evacuation point? Typically, it's in the lowest part of a building. In a flash flood, where is your evacuation point? Typically, that is going to be outside of the building onto high ground. In other words, your evacuation point in a tornado will kill you in a flash flood. And that is why we cannot have generic severe weather type procedures. We must have those broken out by disaster. They must be specific. The other part, and again, when you went back to my earlier slide, we're at Camp Mystic. There was about a 75-minute delay in beginning evacuations. If you have effective procedures, they will only be effective in the middle of the night if you practice those plans. We must have drills. We must have with staff and with the campers themselves. In the middle of the night is not when you need to be figuring things out. It almost needs to be rote. You wake up, an emergency happened, you know exactly what to do when there is an alert. Also, I would say that when you talk to campers, and especially if they're youth, then you can teach them a thing or two about floodplains as a natural resource, but also how to respect the dangers of those rivers. And then finally, borrowing from the emergency management community, could we do something like a tabletop exercise? And then the fifth and final finding, and this is something that I'm going to admit to having even been negligent, as my daughter attended her first day camp in the floodplain of the Big Darby Creek in central Ohio. But that is parents needing to be aware and ask the right questions of camps. Is the camp in a floodplain or a floodway? What are the hazards that can impact the camp? And don't be afraid to ask whoever the camp director is or the camp staff, what are your specific procedures for evacuation? Do not settle for a generic answer. You want to feel comfortable to make sure that they know exactly how your child will be evacuated in such an event. So with that, in terms of next steps, the way we're thinking about this is that we want to promote effective standards for campgrounds and RV parks. And in fact, in some of our research, there is one state, Wisconsin, where ASFPM is headquartered, that has had a very effective state law for over 30 years regulating campgrounds. Again, as I mentioned, Texas they're considering legislation. Also, there should be better coordination with local or state health departments to understand the licensing requirements and everybody working together on campground safety. Having a specific or developing a model emergency action plan specific to the threat of flash flooding, so campground owners could actually go to a place, download that, fill in the particulars for their area, their campground, and then have something that they can use. We should think about developing a tabletop exercise to drill the Camp Mystic scenario, because I really think it was the confluence of the factors. It was a holiday weekend. It was overnight. It was a level of rain that was higher than expected. All of those are the things that make a good exercise. And then finally, having checklists for parents of campers of just the basic questions that they need to ask. So with that, again, I thank you for the little bit of time I've got to talk about this Camp Mystic tragedy. And, as a practicing floodplain manager, it is on us as the professionals in the field to learn from these mistakes and to correct those going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chad. Some great observations, and thank you for your five findings there, very applicable in the Australian context, and which now is a great segue to throw to Will. Will being the Technical Director from Floodplain Management Australia. Over to you, Will.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and it's a pleasure to be here today to be able to share Floodplain Management Australia's perspectives on and lessons learned from the Texas floods. Just going to jump into a different sharing screen here, but I think there's a lot of similarities that we can see between the lessons that Chad pulled out and the lessons that we have here in Australia when it comes to flash flooding. And what I would do in the first instance is to just, I guess, draw some similarities between the floods in Texas and the catchments in Texas and what we have here in Australia. And then step through some of the observations that we have as Floodplain Management Australia in terms of what floodplain management measures exist and might be applicable across our catchments, but also, as you can see, internationally as well. So I guess to start with, in terms of characterising the flood, and I won't go back over the insights that Chad was able to provide us in his presentation. But the key highlights for me really are that these floods had intense short duration rainfall, and as Chad said, we're talking about rainfall there of more than 300 mil in 24 hours, which is not atypical in Australia, but it is a significant amount of rainfall. We've got significant rapid water level rises. So again, as Chad sort of pointed out there, we're talking about 8 meters in 45 minutes. That's really rapid. Very, very, very significant rates of rise, sort of 10 meters per hour. Minimal warning time. And again, Chad stepped us through there the timeline in terms of when the flood watch was first issued, flood warnings were issued, and ultimately there was the emergency alert that was sent through. And that's a similar kind of structure that we have here in Australia for our flood warning and forecasting systems by the Bureau. And I guess that, in inverted commas there, that's what we would define as flash flooding here in Australia for sure. I guess similarly as well, we have steep topography and a range of, unfortunately, a range of fatalities that occurred in Texas. And so when we jump forward and consider can they happen in Australia from a floodplain management perspective, well, I think that we do have a record of where Australia has experienced extreme rainfall. And on the top right there, you can see a plot from the Bureau that shows the world record values for rainfall intensities in the green and the Australian records in the purple. I'll just call out because Chad was highlighting the 2-hour rainfall peak total that fell there in Texas. And we've had 300 mil in the Upper Ross in 1946 here in Australia, over 900 mil in a 24-hour period up in North Queensland in Ballindon First. So absolutely, we have experienced these types of extreme rainfalls. We've also seen rapid water level rises, and I guess one of the case studies in this tragically is the Grantham floods of 2011. And in the bottom right there, you can see an excerpt from the Commission of Inquiry into the Grantham floods, where the water levels at Grantham rose by around 9 meters in an hour and a half. Again, similarly and unsurprisingly, we've got that steep topography and flash flood catchments across Australia. So in short, yes, we do have extreme catastrophic flash flooding in Australia. I would like to spend the majority of the time noting that we're running a little bit behind our anticipated schedule. I'll keep this relatively short, but certainly welcome people reaching out to myself or to Floodplain Management Australia for a little bit more information around some of these and where we think that they're applicable. There are 8 things that I think really jump out at me when I reflect upon the Texas floods and those significant flash floods that we have experienced here in Australia. And we're seeing this move. This is point number 1 for me, risk-based land use planning. So since 2011, at a national scale, we've moved away from the singular mapping of one return period on our land use planning maps, which had the effect of creating a binary approach in terms of measuring or regulating development across our floodplains. I was inside the blue. Okay, I'm at risk. I'm outside of the blue bit on the map. I'm not at risk. We know that all floods across Australia can be different. And so we need to be considering the full spectrum of flooding from the frequent through to the very rare and extreme flood events. And I think we also, when we start looking at the application of risk-based land use planning, not only are we considering the full range of events and the consequence of those impacts, but we should also be considering risk multipliers such as rate of rise, because fundamentally, that will have an impact on how a community is able to respond to a flood event of the nature that we have seen in Texas. Chad was talking there about the emergency management plans and the planning process for the RV parks and the camping grounds. We have a similar process here in Australia, obviously with the application of flood emergency management plans or flood emergency response plans. In my experience, they tend to be applied as a little bit of a catch-all for non-compliance against whether they be DCP, LEP outcomes, or in New South Wales, or with the performance and acceptable outcomes in the Queensland planning space. It doesn't mean that they're appropriate in all of those applications, and we need to be considering the effectiveness and the practicality of those plans, as Chad rightly pointed out, when the flood events happen, not around lunchtime on a Wednesday, but at 2, 3, 4 a.m. on a Friday or a Saturday morning. And we need to, I think, in light of TC Alfred, where we saw the tropical cyclone coming through earlier this year in Australia, coming a little bit further south than what we've seen previously, where our infrastructure was significantly impacted. And again, in my experience, I'm seeing a lot of emergency management plans that have a strong reliance on infrastructure and warning systems. And unfortunately, what we see is they tend to be the first things that are impacted by severe weather events, whether that be because of wind or debris, rain, or indeed floodwaters themselves. Number 3 for me is that I think in terms of lessons learned, in flash flood catchments, we need to be considering a range of flood modelling outputs for the purposes of informing emergency planning, not just the one that produces the peak level, which we use for land use planning purposes. And so we do need to consider that rainfall events are all different. The temporal way in which rain falls can fundamentally change how a flood event behaves. And so what we use as the basis for emergency planning should indeed be different to what we use for land use planning. The 4th one here that I've thought was worthy of a call out is that whilst we have a definition of flash flooding from the Bureau of Meteorology as it relates to its flood forecasting and warning services, I see different definitions of flash flooding across the country, and I think we need to get some consistency in that definition for the purposes of educating and informing communities about the risks of flash flooding. I also think there's a gap in terms of where shelter in place or refuge in place is appropriate. New South Wales has some guidance on it, but that's a very much a standalone piece of guideline, and I think there is value in seeing some consistency in that as well. I'm sure Rob will talk to this and Wendy will talk to this, but again, I just want to back in the need for continued investment in enhancing our flash flood forecasting capability. We know the Bureau's functionality typically deals on those flood events that are not flash floods, where we have longer rainfall to flood warning times beyond 6 hours, which means like in Texas, like in places that we have seen flash flooding in Australia, there just simply isn't the flash flood forecasting capability, and that falls to either local government or the SES to try and fill that gap. And then I'll probably just wrap up very quickly, again, acknowledging time. We need to continue to inform and work with our communities to educate them around the risks of flash flooding, not just riverine flooding, which can produce the very deep and very long-lasting floods, but those that can occur very rapidly and have a significant risk to public safety. And of course, I would also, as Andrew pointed out, speak to the need for, where appropriate, where maybe historically we've got land uses in places that we now know to be at an unacceptable or intolerable risk, programs around managed retreat and community relocation. And we're seeing some of those programs across Queensland and New South Wales, which are having a fundamental benefit in terms of avoiding future flood risk. I'd leave it there. Again, just mindful of time and pass it back to Andrew. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Will. Some good practical tips and considerations there for floodplain managers across Australia. I'm now going to hand to Wendy Sharples from the Bureau of Meteorology. So, Wendy, thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. I hope everyone can hear me. Yeah, so just to recap, flash floods are really dangerous due to their limited warning time, their sudden and rapid onset. They're a velocity-driven hazard, so often there's powerful currents and submerged hazards. And due to the impervious nature of the ground and the flat areas of urban areas, they're likely to occur in populated areas and also in campgrounds, as Chad and Will have both mentioned. And just to recap, the flash flooding event in Texas was no different, where the meteorological trigger was an intense stationary storm cell fueled by tropical moisture and exacerbated by the steep topography funneling waters down onto saturated ground, where the hydrological response was described as a wall of water. And I think there was 8 to 10 meters rise in about 90 minutes, as Chad and Will have both mentioned. So the defining danger was that rapidly moving front, and there were several warnings issued, as Chad mentioned. However, unfortunately, those warnings didn't reach the people impacted in a sufficient lead time, as they had a lack of flood awareness, and the other contributing factors were power outages, network congestion, and also, as Chad mentioned, it was during the night. So there was a lack of visual cues, which made it really hard to respond. And unfortunately, that meant that over 100 people lost their lives, and many of those were children. And after such a tragedy, a lot of people like to point the finger at people to blame. And some people have tried to point the finger at the National Weather Service, where the consensus is that the National Weather Service did as well as could be expected for such a extreme event. And maybe many people want to also point the finger at Trump. However, in this case, there's expert consensus that staffing shortages did not affect the forecast quality of the event, and probably not very helpful at the moment to say that this weather event is an act of God, because there are contributing factors to these events. Though I'll just go through them quickly. Number one is climate change. So with a warming atmosphere, you hold more moisture. So these stationary extreme storm cells are going to become more prevalent, unfortunately. And as Chad went through, there's failures in land use planning that contributed to this, and also in the warning system chain. And last of all, there's a lack of public awareness, and that meant some of the warnings went unheeded, unfortunately. Was there an analogous flash flooding event of that magnitude in Australia? And yes, there is. As Will mentioned, the Locklear Valley floods of 2011 were similar in magnitude, where there was a similar meteorological trigger. This time the cell storm was driven by La Nina. The topography funneling the water onto already saturated ground was there as well. The hydrological response was described as an inland tsunami, where the flood front was moving faster than a person could run, unfortunately. And there were several warnings issued for that event, but that did not prevent fatalities of over 20 lives lost. So the Locklear Valley event illustrates that similar disasters could happen in Australia, and risk factors could combine to produce a catastrophic event such as the one in Texas, where you could see that other populated areas such as capital cities, if this event of this magnitude would occur, would be catastrophic. And it's probably worth reiterating to say that by the time you view a flash flood of this magnitude, it's already too late to evacuate. So your survival depends on measures taken well before the threat is imminent, which is why it's so important, as Chad and Will have gone through, to have those plans and strategies in place. So what will flash floods look like in the future? And I'm sorry to say that Australia's exposure to flash floods in the future is increasing as risk factors are changing. So a warming world means heavier rainfall bursts, compound events and extremes. There's also increases in urbanisation, and with that comes some poor land use planning decisions, as Will pointed out. There's also changes in population demographics, where some areas have a more elderly, less mobile population, and unfortunately there's decreasing SES and emergency management volunteers. However, I don't want to end on a doom and gloom note, because there is some great research that is currently going on that's supported by NHRA and NEMA, and I'm just going to highlight some through the lens of the emergency management cycle and this will hopefully improve Australia's resilience to future flash flooding. Where in the preparedness space, we're looking at the chance of flooding a season ahead, much like the bushfire outlook. In the response space, we're improving flash flood prediction and communication by using AI for very accurate water level prediction, and therefore increasing the lead time for warning significantly. And we're looking at communication science and behavioural psychology, and it would be great to learn from the National Weather Service in the US as to what they're doing there too. And in the mitigation space, we're looking at projected flood impacts under various scenarios at 2 and 3 degrees warming, so we can see how the floodplain boundaries are changing and where the emerging areas of risk are. And thank you very much for listening. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Wendy. And yes, great research that you and your colleagues at the Bureau are using, which clearly has some great useful outcomes in this context of building safer communities here in Australia. I'm now going to pass on to our final panelist, Rob Webb, CEO of AFAC. Take it away, Rob.
Thanks for having me in this conversation. I'll complement what each of the speakers have said. I'm to give you a sense of who I am and where I'm from. It's most of my early career, I was a flash flood meteorologist, providing warnings. As I went through, I became more of a weather communicator, providing briefings to both communities and to emergency managers. Found myself out the back end being promoted beyond my levels of expertise, and I now find myself at AFAC enjoying walking in another circle, working with emergency managers. And this is part of a series of international events that I've been looking at and thinking, what can we bring back to Australia in a really pragmatic way, and thinking that at community level, what are we really asking our communities to do, and what are we asking too much of them? Or if we have knowledgeable communities, do we have the answers that they ask for? So when I looked at this, I took a typical lessons approach to this afterwards and thought, I just want to understand this event. And this is a map of the basin, a big basin, and they talk about the flash flood alley cutting through the middle of this. What's interesting is that a little part that drove this in Kerr County, up in the far top left of this image, this little South Guadalupe River, is where the bulk of this action happened. The bulk of the rain fell right on top of this little bowl, and it couldn't handle the amount of water that came through, and ultimately went into the main river system and flooded at Kerrville as well. People on which is just downstream here. But the bulk of the rainfall that fell was there in a little patch of land that's about 30 kilometres long by 10 kilometres wide, which in itself is quite a small part of land. So just to look at some radar imagery, the radar you're seeing here is just straight from some National Weather Service high resolution radar, typical to the same radar that the Bureau of Meteorology have here. And what you'll see as I loop through, the individual storms, typical, I can imagine being a warning meteorologist on this day, storms are moving, it's in an environment conducive to flash flooding. They start to build on the back edge of the storm or the cell. And then all of a sudden over that little white area, which is that catchment I was talking about with Camp Mystic, it might be jumping around a bit for you, but you'll just see that all of a sudden you get this location sitting right at the right spot. If it's offset by 10 kilometres either way, then you're getting half the volume of rainfall. And when you're thinking each millimetre of rain is 1 litre per metre squared, so if you add that up across everything, you're dropping a whole lot of rainfall. And ultimately speaking, a meteorologist, I'm not a hydrologist, but I've worked with a lot and given them some dodgy forecasts over time. But it's pretty tricky to pick the scales and rainfall at these scales. So you're never going to get a huge amount of lead time on the catastrophic event, I don't think anyway. And that's something that I'm interested in talking a little bit about today. But if I look at some of the data that's available from the National Severe Storms Laboratory, this is information that they supply through to weather service officers, etc. The area that we're looking at here is on this road here is just near the Kerr County, is a road that basically follows the South Fork of the Guadalupe River. And the Camp Mystic that we've talked about today sits about at this little part of the W here. It comes up to a place called Hunt here, and that's where it joins the North Fork and travels down to Kerrville. And I should say straight away that this is a meteorologist talking about land that he's never been to, never seen, and it's reconstructing. So please bear with me. But what they do is start to put things in. I see a lot of storms. I see a lot of rainfall around. How significant is this? And they're producing some of the guidance, which I think would be fantastic use to emergency management authorities in just picking where should I be focused on. So this is to 1 a.m. in the morning. No flash flood warnings out yet. A flood watch is out. There's flash flood warnings further south in this Bandera County at this time, but there's no real storms further north in this Kerr County. Then by 2 a.m, if I look at that, this is a recurrence interval on the flow rates that it's inferring straight from radar, because there's no gauges. We think we go to the US, they must be gauged everywhere, but the reality is they don't have any more gauges than we do in this part of the world. In fact, Kerr County is the same size as the Lockyer Valley City. It's got the same population base as the Lockyer Valley, population density as the Lockyer Valley Council area in Queensland. So you pick it up, put it in Australia, and you've got the same event if we're unlucky. Thankfully, we're not unlucky every year. But this is sort of tipping over a 1 in 10 year event for this by 2 a.m. So you'd be pulling the handle on a flash flood warning, because you're starting to get up to something that's significant, particularly over the area, remembering this is covering a bit of the catchment here. Then by 3 a.m, I'll just step back one. It's sort of sitting in the upper parts of the forward parts or the eastern parts of the catchment. And then there's a little bit more back building and development further back here. And you're getting up to that 50 to 100 year return rates, which you're saying that's starting to pull the trigger on some much stronger wording. But you don't know. This is all telling you what's already happened. It's a radar image. It's in no means is it a forecast image. And then by 4 a.m, the 1 hour, it's covering a broad area. Now, if I put this back and look at the significance of this event over 3 hours, and you start to get a sense that sitting right on top of that catchment, you've got an incredibly significant event that if you offset it in any direction, there's other catchments that are affected. But this is one of those things that you would be hard to go to bed at night expecting. You could be so unlucky as to have this happen in your or to be as unlucky as this. But particularly if you're living at Kerrville, and most of the heavy rain, you didn't have the bonus, we'll call it, of heavy rain to tell you that it was there. So that puts it in a bit of perspective. Now, if I go to put that catchment on some of the horror nights of my life as a forecaster around the Wollongong catchment, Wollongong down to there, that's the sort of size of the catchment if you look at there. If I go to Coffs Harbour, another place where the ranges hit the coast really quickly, you've got a sense of the size of that blob and the significance of that. And then if I go to the Lockyer Valley, we've already talked about that a few times. This little area here, that's the size of the catchment we're talking about. You remember if you might remember back in 2011, Toowoomba had a big flash flood from this particular area here. I'll just step through this at hourly intervals, but the main up at the catchment of the Lockyer Valley area, sort of sitting in this area west of Gatton, and huge amounts of rain fell through here over the course of 2 hours was enough to change. But if you use your imagination and think of this catchment area here, underneath where this is going, and then you go to there, by 1 p.m, by 2 p.m, it's moving through, and then it's moved on. So this is these tiny moments of catastrophe that drive a catastrophe. In the scheme of a really broad warning, community being told they should prepare, but the actual focus of the catastrophe is a really short period of time, driven by the conditions on the ground. So just gives you some perspective of, one, the predictability of being able to narrow it down to an area. But I'll talk a little bit about the implications of that. The other thing I just want to talk about is what this community is thinking. And the thing I ask about the Kerrville community at this time, and I've got a whole range of things to look at. How significant was it, and what was driving the news? What had people's attention during this time in the months leading in? This is a map of discharge or average stream flow across the Kerrville area, the Guadalupe River at Kerrville. And what was interesting, when I was doing my investigation, it was only a year before that it made news that the first time that this particular river had broken its banks in 6 years. This is a community that was, in the last couple of years, had been in a quite amount of drought. In fact, this black line being the last year of stream flow, it's been triggering around the lowest on record. So the concept that you need a saturated catchment to get a flash flood, I think that in itself, it's a lesson for us here in Australia. If we're pushing fire danger and fire danger ratings, big summer drought, things like that, it doesn't stop you getting a flash flood. And you can see here that just before this big peak in July of this year, the actual average daily stream flow was amongst the lowest on record. And that's driving the discourse, and that's the feeling people have. So they're probably being tuned to something else. I talked to you about the significance of how quickly it increased too. We often talk about height, but if you look at the flow of the water, I think it's about 0.3 cubic meters a second. If you think of a cubic meter as a meter by meter by meter, a cube moving past a particular point in this river, that's at 2 a.m. By 3 a.m. down towards Kerrville, it was 82 of those cubic meters of water moving past every second. By 4 a.m. it was 127. Thinking, close your eyes and think of that. But then by 5 a.m, it was 5,380 of those cubic meter blocks moving past every second. So this is a significant change in the information, and remarkable. Even looking at all the stuff I've looked at over a 30-year career of looking at this, these types of things still make your jaw drop. If I think about warning systems as well, and I want to think of this, often we look at that last mile warning right down to the alerts and the sirens. I think of warnings as this many decades, and it's about making good decisions based on what you know, both to change the way land's used, to ask people to make changes that sometimes might be important to save their lives or the next generation. Now, the disaster risk knowledge is the hub of this, and I think the speakers before me have also talked about disaster risk knowledge. We often think of it as a flood height. We look at a flood study and we think of this magical 1% line, but when we think about disaster risk knowledge, it's got to be specific to the hazard and how that hazard will unfold, but importantly, how that hazard will unfold and affect the things that community value. Will it come on really fast? Will it come on really slow? And I just don't think that, even as meteorologists, as hydrologists, as community members, as emergency managers, we've truly had a conversation about what disaster risk is and how things may unfold. Some places after the disaster, they've got a point in time, but maybe having that ability to tell stories of how the disaster might unfold. And if you don't have that, how can you prepare a plan? So coming around there, you ideally want to have detection and monitoring systems if you can, but there's no way we are going to gauge every tiny little catchment in every part of Australia. We need to use risk-based assessments to say which are the ones we need to gauge. but we also need to be able to work with communities and local levels who want to provide local warning systems. Because if there's no government level or institutional warning system, there's still so much you can do to save your life, which might be just walking a few steps up to get some higher ground or sheltering in place. But that's that to me, we provide a broad scale warning system that in no way will be able to provide the level of detail the local community in one of the little inlets or streams might need. So they will go and develop their own, but we've got to work with these communities in that mindset as well to help them make themselves safe. Warning dissemination, in this case, if we told them, if we're planning a response system to say that you may not get more than 30 minutes warning of this happening. So you have to design your plan to work within 30 minutes or no warning. And that to me, for the people in Camp Mystic, and I have no idea exactly what happened. All I know is that there's a flood watch that's issued. Was issued that they only get about 2 a year, looking back over the last 5 to 7 years. They get about 2 flood watches a year. So the logical thing might be in that case, even if you only get an hour's warning, don't put your most vulnerable children down by the river that night. Put them up higher. But that who knows what the decision-making processes were. But we have to set our warning systems up to deal with the weakest link. And I'll call that weak, not because it's bad, but because science doesn't always allow us to provide the longer-term prediction. We expect it will. We hang it on the bureau. Sometimes you didn't forecast, but I used to say, yeah, I wish I could. I'm flattered you think I could forecast that, but I have no hope. So, but that's not to say that the information they provide is not useful. So I want to leave you just with where I think there's some words from the judge who did the Grantham inquiry, and they talk. There are many areas in Queensland, indeed Australia, where there's always a chance of dangerous and destructive floods, bushfires, or storms. But people don't, for that reason, quit those areas. They are reasons to study the area, learn, and prepare. So they can't be prevented, but the loss of life or property can be prevented. And he actually goes on to say, in my respectful view, just because one day a flood could strike Grantham, there's no reason to leave it, but only on one condition, that the people who stay there are fully equipped, or they must accept that they have to, there's a duty that they and the following generations need to continually update and learn about the future risk. And there's words in here, the duty is to look at the facts with cold objectivity, that's to say without any emotional prejudice. Now, this could be read as being critical of communities, but this to me is a beacon for us to say, we have to put the hands of this information in the hands of our communities to make good decisions on all timescales and become good storytellers, so that the people of Grantham now, the judge said they should not have, they could not have been expected to understand that the waters could rise that quickly. And that may be true, but I also went on to say, but they shouldn't, that can never happen again, because we've seen it now. So there's basically no excuses. And that to me isn't just putting it on the community. We have to work much harder at connecting to our communities, not shouting at them, not yelling at them with noise, enabling them to make quality decisions to protect the things that they hold as valuable, not necessarily the things that we hold as valuable. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Rob, and some good closing remarks there as well. So just by way of wrapping up, I want to thank all our speakers. I think just some key themes coming through, particularly land use planning, risk-based land use planning, make sure that we're not developing in these high-risk areas where flash flooding is going to occur in the first instance anyway. But I also think one of the key things coming through there is about warning systems, understanding where there are gaps in our flash flood warning systems across the country, because we've exposed some of those already. We've seen some of the great research that Wendy's spoken about, which can help answer some of the questions, but particularly in high-risk local government areas, we need to understand where the gaps are, and perhaps even some of the governance arrangements around flash flood warnings in Australia as well. One other thing that I just want to bring up just in closing remarks that we haven't touched on to date in what we're speaking about is most flash flood fatalities are motorists. It goes to the key messaging around don't drive through floodwater, but it's also about understanding high-risk road sections, and I refer you to research that has been done previously, sponsored by NHRA, around appreciating road characteristics associated with flood fatalities and developing risk assessment methods to identify high-risk sections of roads in relation to flash flooding, so we can be avoiding that risk and eliminating that risk as much as possible as well. So I do want to thank our speakers again and thank AFAC for partnering on this webinar with us. A recording of it will be made available after today, and it'll be on our YouTube channel. And for those that really want to get in on a lot of the NHRA webinars, they're all on our YouTube channel. Great viewing on a weekend. And so we look forward to seeing you at our future webinars, which are upcoming and on this slide right now. So please keep in touch with the Centre, subscribe to our newsletter, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. So thank you very much.